Okay, so I want to talk about mainly Cryos Egg Donor Program for a little bit, and I want to tell you about the criteria that we have, the objectives that we want to talk about today. So we're going to talk about Cryos Egg Donors and the criteria for selecting and approving egg donors. I want to compare the advantages and disadvantages of fresh versus frozen cycles. And I also want to talk about are vitrified eggs as good in terms of pregnancies are vitrified eggs as good in terms of pregnancies as fresh egg cycles. All right, so our donors. Who are our donors? They're young, healthy women, ages 18 to 30. Most are required to have some higher level of education. They must meet certain physical standards that we'll talk about shortly. And we only accept about 4% of all the applications that we get. So we go through a lot of donor applications. And I'll tell you, the biggest one that we lose donors on is BMI. It's tough to get somebody in the right BMI range to be a donor for us. So. Our criteria is that they have a AMH of 2.5 nanograms per milliliter. They need to have a reproductive examination and antral follicle count. We prefer donors with children, but that's challenging. 18 to 30-year-olds may or may not have children. So I'll tell you that probably half of the ones that come into us do have children and half don't have children. Is that right? Okay. Additional criteria, they have to be healthy both mentally and physically. We do a family history, and we evaluate the motives of donors. We've had a couple of donors that we didn't take because we knew the motivations behind the donation were not sincere. They were either coerced or things like that. We won't have that. So the donor screening that we do is pretty standard that most of you do with your donors. We do infectious disease screening. We do a family history. We can't tell everything from infectious disease alone, so we have to have family histories. We evaluate the risk factors, and that includes things like alcohol consumption and sex partners and all. We also do a genetic screening. We do a psychological exam through an external counselor. We do a karyotype, we do a blood type, and the AMH, like I talked about before, and antral follicle count. At Cryos, we only vitrify the top quality eggs, and of course everybody's question is, what are top quality eggs? We base that on morphology alone. That's the only thing that we really can base eggs on. We don't have any way to test them and say this is a good quality egg versus a bad quality egg. But we only freeze the perfect eggs. If they look perfect, the zonas are perfect, the paravigilant space, there's no vacuoles or anything like that in them, that's what we freeze. We use all the other eggs, we save them for training, which I'll talk about in a minute, or they go to research or that sort of stuff. So we don't waste eggs, but for the donor program, the only eggs we use are M2, top quality M2s. Vitrification success comes with experience, and I'm going to show you this in a little bit when I talk about the success of frozen eggs. Warming is very critical, and that's the often overlooked part. A lot of people think that it's just like warming embryos. It's not. It's a little more technically challenging, and I think all the embryologists would probably agree with that. It is a little bit of a sticking point for some people. At Cryos, we have things called reference clinics, and a lot of you are. When we sign you up as a reference clinic, we look at how well you perform by the national averages. So if you're above national averages, we'll probably work with you as a reference clinic. We'll come out and we'll train you to warm the eggs. And I always hesitate using the word training because I don't feel that we're training. Most embryologists know how to warm eggs. But there are subtle differences between the way we warm eggs, the way Fairfax warms eggs, the way World Egg Bank. There's little differences, and those differences count when you're warming eggs. We have a number of types of donors, and I don't really want to go into this much, but we do have anonymous and non-anonymous. And again, the anonymous donors, we are an international company, and that's a big reason why we continue to have anonymous. But we also have a lot of people in the U.S. that still pick anonymous donors. We do counsel the donors prior to them entering the program that anonymity doesn't exist anymore, and the chance of them being truly anonymous is not going to happen. So fresh versus frozen donor eggs. You guys, I'm sure all the REIs and most of the embryologists know about the fresh donor cycles. The recipient selects the donor. There we go. The donor undergoes screening. They stimulate and monitor, and they synchronize the cycles with the recipients as well. The eggs are retrieved from the donor. They're fertilized, they're grown for 3 to 5 days, and transferred back to the recipient. Remaining embryos are frozen, usually. I would assume they'll all be frozen. I don't think anybody throws them away, but they're frozen. The advantages to a fresh donor are, in most cases, you get the entire batch of eggs from the retrieval, so anywhere from 10 to 30 plus eggs. So, there is a slight advantage to that. It's usually a high number, like I said. The more oocytes that you get, the more chances of good quality embryos you have. You start with 30, you got a good chance of ending up with a good number of good quality embryos. The more embryos that you have that are good quality, of course, the more that you have to freeze later. And the cost is slightly higher with fresh eggs, just starting the cycle. But then, on the other hand, you often end up with many more frozen embryos that you can do frozen transfers on. So when we talk about cost, it's kind of 6 of one, half dozen another. There is advantages to fresh eggs because you do end up with more embryos. And then, on the other hand, it costs more. So it's a tough one to weigh out sometimes. The disadvantages of frozen eggs, it takes time. To find a donor, select the donor, screen the donor, it takes anywhere from 3 months to a year before you're doing an embryo transfer. Some people are faster than others, but a year can be pretty common with some people to find an egg donor. Syncing the egg donor and recipient, this maybe isn't such a big factor anymore because most people are doing freeze-all cycles, and they even do that with the egg donors. There may not be an issue with syncing the donor and the recipient. But when you do have to do it, it is difficult. You have to get them synced well. It takes a little bit of time and a good doctor that can make it happen. There's also donor liability that's included in this, and that includes things like the donor screwing up taking their meds. They don't take their meds. That is a big problem. They spend a lot of money to get them there. They're paying for all the medications. They're paying for all their visits. You could do a retrieval and not get any eggs, and most people, the recipients are on the hook for the retrieval. So, and of course, there's things like ovarian hyperstimulation or that sort of thing that can happen that the donor ends up in the hospital. In most cases, that is also a responsibility of the recipients who are receiving the eggs. And of course, there's regulatory compliance. That's a huge deal. I'm sure everybody's aware of that. We all have some donors of some sort, and we have to do FDA compliance and that sort of thing. But it takes up time. If you do a lot of egg donations, it takes up almost a full-time person. And again, cost is or is not a factor with fresh eggs. So what are the advantages to frozen egg donor cycles? Well, convenience, first of all. You don't need to sync the donors and the recipients. It's just not necessary. You don't have to worry about donor retrieval and not getting any eggs. We have the eggs there, so you know you're going to get the eggs. You're going to get the eggs that you've ordered, plain and simple. You order 6, you're going to get 6. There's no questions. It's also frees up your lab schedule. I know many people batch their cycles, and if you have a day where you have 8 retrievals on a particular day, you don't necessarily have to start your eggs that day. You can fertilize on the next day when you have 2 retrievals or something of that nature, but it does free up the lab schedule a little bit. Oftentimes, the banks can offer many more donors than most clinics can offer. And again, most of them are all available from the banks. Success. Success, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, but success, vitrification has gotten a lot better over the past years. I feel it's even gotten better in the last 5 years, but it has gotten better over the last 10 years at least. And the advances that we've had in the cryobiology and the embryo culture has led to birth rates that are very similar to the same things that we're seeing with fresh eggs. And I'll show you that in a moment. Because I know some people shake their heads at that and don't think so. But cost. The cost of frozen eggs is lower initially than fresh eggs. So, of course, there are some disadvantages to donor eggs, to be fair. I don't think there's any disadvantages at all, but I'm going to point out what there may be disadvantages. You get a smaller number of eggs usually. We will sell eggs in any number, but typically when you buy eggs from a donor bank, They sell them in cohorts of 6 to 8 eggs. Of course, fewer eggs lead to fewer embryos. Warming of oocytes is technically challenging, like I said before. Again, it's one cell. With an embryo, you got 60, 70 cells, you kill a couple of them, they still make a nice embryo in the end. Oocyte, you got one cell, you kill it, you killed it. So it is a little more challenging. Again, the cost can be a disadvantage to the frozen eggs as well because you don't end up with as many in the end to freeze. Obviously, the cost of transferring a frozen embryo is cheaper. So if you have leftover embryos to transfer, the cycle is usually much less than the fresh IVF cycle. So there is that disadvantage to us. But I will say that in our cycles, 58% of the people who use our cycles end up with more than one frozen or more than one blastocyst. So they have a blastocyst to freeze, at least one. We have about 44% blastocyst rate, meaning most people are getting at least 2 embryos out of every batch. So I put that on there to show that we're catching up with the fresh eggs. And this is just something that I put together. This is kind of just a basic cost thing. You can argue whether it's correct or not, but it kind of shows the differences between fresh and frozen egg cost. All right, so now I'm going to try and prove to you that frozen eggs are equal to fresh eggs in terms of data. It's difficult to find international data, so I don't have any international data to back it up with. The only thing I can find is SART data, which for us is well and good because we're all pretty much from the US and SART is the one that we deal with. SART data, statistics show frozen eggs success rate for 2017 was 39%. I'm sorry, I have 18 on the bottom of the slide, but it is actually 2017 was the data. So they had 39% take-home baby rate. That's pretty low compared to the fresh donor baby rate. But my question is the SART data accurate? Okay. And what I mean by accurate is it really showing the picture of frozen eggs done by somebody who understands how to do eggs, particularly a bank? Well, we got to remember that they're taking into account all the frozen eggs that were used in the US in 2017. And no offense to anybody who's here, but when ASRM made it the standard of care, a lot of people got the idea that we're going to start our own egg bank, we'll do split cycles, we'll save eggs, we'll do this. So we're looking at a lot of eggs that have been frozen by a lot of people who maybe were not as proficient at freezing eggs as they should have been. So I argue that data includes some iffy labs. Anyway, we'll get into that a little bit more later. So I took a look at our own statistics, the World Egg Bank statistics, Fairfax statistics, and Donor Egg Bank. All the stuff is published, it's online, this is the stuff they put out there, these are their numbers. We had a cumulative pregnancy rate of 54% and a live birth rate of 44%. So just looking at the banks, who will argue, that's what they do for a living, that's all they do, we're much more close to being what the SART data is with fresh eggs. Fresh eggs with SART data was 48.9%. The 4 of us combined, we were 44%. So I would argue that that's pretty much the same thing. We're slightly lower, but that is coming up. And this was the only 2 people who publish online their annual data is us and another bank who I won't name. And you can see these are our rates. I don't like the survival rate because I don't believe that survival is indicated by looking at an egg once you warm it and it looks like it's lived. We know as embryologists that many of them don't fertilize, they don't grow or do what else. So I don't really put much into the survival rate. But anyway, the clinical pregnancy rate was very similar. They were 58%, we were above 70%. The number that had surplus embryos, meaning something to freeze, basically around 60%. And both practices were, the ongoing and live birth rate was 50 to 55%. So, I argue using this data, looking at the professionals who freeze eggs, frozen eggs are equal to fresh eggs. And then I have a couple of slides here, and this one just shows some other studies. This was just from an article that was in Furt and Sturt. It just shows that, Other people have compared fresh eggs to frozen eggs, and everybody's finding basically the same thing. They had 61% with fresh eggs and 59% with frozen eggs. Excuse me. And this slide shows the same thing again. It actually shows the fresh rate, or the frozen rate was slightly higher than the fresh rate, but it wasn't statistically significant. But it also shows the miscarriage rate with the embryos, and it was not different. So going back to SART again, we can question the data a little bit, but the one big thing that this one shows is last year, or in 2017, I'm sorry, there were 3,324 cases using fresh eggs. When we look at the frozen eggs, they had 3,452 cases. So this was the first year, 2017 was the first year that since SART has taken the data, that actually more cases were done with frozen eggs than fresh eggs. So there is definitely a new trend in the market. Frozen eggs are becoming the norm. And I'll show you here, this is where they say it's 48.9%, and if you look at that one, it just says 39.3%. There is a difference there, but again, I think it has to do with the number of people they're comparing and who they're looking at with the eggs that are produced. So, are vitrified donor eggs the new standard? Well, you don't need to recruit, screen, or approve donors. That's a big deal. That can take a full person out of your staff that has to do that. There's no donor payment, so you don't have to worry about taxes and 1099s. There's no regulatory concerns. When you receive eggs from a bank, you get all the paperwork, all the summary of records, everything's done. You know that donor's compliant. There's nothing to worry about. And that could take another person off of your staff. There's no synchronizing of the donor and recipients. That's a thing of the past with frozen eggs. There's just certainly no need to do it. In fact, you can't do it because we've already had them in the freezer for a while, so you wouldn't be able to. We ease lab pressure and the workload. We guarantee that you'll have a blastocyst transfer. With our program, we guarantee that if you buy 6 eggs, you get at least 1 good quality blastocyst transfer. If not, we replace the eggs. So there's not too much of a worry about that. As I said before, we provide a greater selection than most private practices do. I believe we have 138 or something like that donors on the web. And it varies from 138 to 150. It goes up and down. The eggs are immediately available, so you don't have to worry about waiting for them. You don't have a 3-month wait or a 2-month wait or anything else. And the results are improving. I think year over year, the results are improving. I think there was a learning curve in terms of using frozen eggs. We learned how to freeze them, but I think we all had to learn how to culture them better and how to warm them better. I know that I've seen the success climb greatly in the past 8 years that I've been doing frozen eggs. And every year it pops up a little bit better. And I think it's just that the labs get better at it, and we get better at freezing them, and it just works out well. So the takeaway from this talk, success rates for using frozen donor eggs are dependent on several factors. The quality of the donor eggs themselves, the ability to perform effective freezing and thawing of eggs, the number of eggs that are thawed and the number of embryos that are produced, the expertise and quality of the IVF program, and I can't say enough how important that is. We can freeze eggs all day, but we also have to have a good lab to use the eggs in. We have an embryo development program also at Cryos where we produce 2 blastocysts. If you all are interested in that, you can talk to me or anybody else about that as well. And thank you.